Morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to help frame the next session on Global Risk 2021. I'm the Director of Foresight at the Atlantic Council. I was formerly a counselor at the Intelligence Council. In this practice on foresight, our bread and butter is helping our corporate government foundation partners to think about global risks and global trends. We also, besides the negative side, think about the opportunities. And I wanted to give you a taste of how we're looking at 2021. And myself, as well as my assistant director, Anka, will go through the risks and opportunities that we see for the coming year. I have the bad cop role here and to go through some of the risks, and she will take over and look at, on the much more optimistic side, some of the opportunities. So the first one is obviously on COVID. I mean, all of us would like to get out of this pandemic, but we have to face the fact that it could actually be a long time still in 2021, or even lingering after that in parts of the world where the vaccine has a hard time of reaching. We also have to look at mutations. You know, we've seen a number of new strains develop. We're holding our breath on one that has cropped up in the UK, and just hoping that the vaccines will actually still help with those that have the new strains. Final thing is just the logistics of getting the vaccine out. We expect that we'll have travel restrictions in place for a good part of the year, which hampers us all. The second big one is a worry about divided America. The election didn't settle the divisions there, and you know, the degree to which the Biden presidency can actually begin to heal those divisions and implement much needed reforms. The third one is a debt crisis in the developing world, one that we have not seen for a long time, and one that can actually make it much harder for the global economy to recover. Now, connected with that debt crisis in the developing world are two other phenomenon or developments: a food crisis, which has already started. It not only affects the developing world, but you see also here with higher prices that the poor are really struggling. You also, connected with the food crisis, really is the downward pressure on the global middle class. You know, all of us were praising how the world had managed to eliminate a lot of poverty over the last 3 decades, with the global middle class feeling the pressure from the economic slowdown. We're seeing increasing numbers of those back in extreme poverty, and also in regular poverty. And we're wondering if this is going to be a permanent or a temporary. Hopefully the temporary side, but at least in 2021, the pressure is going to be downward. On the geopolitical level, you know, North Korea crisis is almost inevitable. They haven't been getting the attention that is usual for them. With an incoming president, they're going to test the resolve of the administration. Taiwan crisis with China seems to be growing. And looking to the Middle East, the Biden administration wants to get back into the JCPOA, but it could be that we're due for a confrontation with Iran. And finally, with Turkey, growing rift between Turkey and NATO. but also Turkey and the rest of its neighbors. So we have a item there on risk of Turkey that is going even more rogue than before. So I hope you're sufficiently depressed. As I said, we're going to turn to the opportunities, and hopefully, with risks, we have various probabilities attached to them. They don't necessarily have to happen. And obviously the hope is that we have many more opportunities crop up than risks. Anka, take it over.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, this seems very depressing, but not all is doom and gloom. 2021 clearly also presents opportunities for the Biden administration. And in the paper that we'll be releasing this week, you will get to see also the top 10 chances the US can take. Today, I'm just going to be talking about one that is at the top of the list, and that is reviving multilateralism. As we've all heard in recent public statements, the Biden administration has pledged to rejoin the institutions that the US has left in the past 4 years. At the very top of the list, the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Accord. That is a very welcome first step, but we believe that there's an opportunity for more structural reform of the multilateral system, both to account for geopolitical realities and to prepare us for the future. Two examples would be the World Trade Organization and the UN. As the global economy recovers slowly in the aftermath of COVID-19, reviving the World Trade Organization can bolster trade and can help us move further away from fragmentation and stall the rise of protectionism. Similarly, a UN reform can be a step towards maybe managing and developing governance structures for new areas such as emerging technologies or space. Clearly, in all of these efforts, as we heard both in the previous panel and in this paper, working alongside allies and partners will be crucial, especially those in Europe. The transatlantic community has both the will to put multilateralism front and center, an interest in raising global standards by cooperating via these institutions, and then a need to push back against the nefarious influence of global challengers. Regardless, this year it's an inflection point for the US and the world. And how we like to think about it when we have multiple alternative futures ahead of us is use strategic foresight as the most important tool to help us uncover the right path ahead. FSR has been doing this for years. Most recently, in the summer, we released our report entitled What World Post-COVID-19? 3 Scenarios, that, as the title says, analyzes the long-term impact of the pandemic and develops some scenarios to help us think through what its implications could be. In February, we have another report coming up, Global Foresight 2021, which will dive deeper into the trends marking the next years. And don't forget about the paper that we're releasing this week, which will be public starting tomorrow. Either way, strategic foresight is an important first step to maybe bending the arc of history in the right direction. So with this easy task in mind of, helping us uncover the future, preparing for what's next, and also taking the right actions, I'm happy to pass it on to Ryan Heath, Senior Editor for Political. Take it away, Ryan.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Anka. My name's Ryan Heath, and I write Politico's Global Translations newsletter. And alongside my colleague, Louisa Savage, I host a podcast of the same name. So that's why you've got me with you today. But it's now my great pleasure to welcome as panelists, Lieutenant General James Clapper, the former Director of National Intelligence, and Ellen Lapson, who's President Emeritus of the Stimson Center and also Director of the International Security Program at George Mason University. Thank you both for joining.
Well, okay. Thanks for having us.
We'll dive right in. A lot has changed in 2020, but in many ways, those changes were merely accelerations of existing trends. I'm thinking the rise of China, the digitization of our economy, the polarization of our politics. So I'll start with the same question to both of you. What do you consider the major unaddressed or under-addressed risks in the landscape that President-elect Biden and his team will need to immediately confront? General, let's start with your answer.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan. I guess the threat I would mention or challenge I would mention is which I think is actually transcends all others, is climate change. And I guess I would nominate that for first on this list of top risks. And in my view, not to be melodramatic about it, but as the UN recently stated that if we don't do something, we, the globe, do something about this pretty quick, the planet's going to become an uninhabitable hell. And that, to me, transcends all these other challenges and threats that we have. I mean, clearly the Earth is warming at a faster rate than science had forecast, and sea level is rising. And you only need to look at the the empirical evidence of that. And to me, that transcends all else. And I clearly, the opportunity here, of course, is to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. And I would also offer that in terms of an opportunity that this may be an area where, with all the other disagreements we have with China, where we could work with China. A little notice speech that President Xi made last September would indicate if it's, on the level that China may have an interest in a renewed or a kindled interest in attacking climate change, of course, and China's got to be a player there. So there are others, but I would certainly highlight that as a preeminent threat.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-up there. I guess that then naturally means walking and chewing gum at the same time, where we can't ignore other challenges or threats from China. But unless the US and China work in lockstep, it does seem that the world isn't able to make big enough steps on climate change.
Well, clearly we're going to have disagreements with China. We certainly do. Many disagreements, but I would just offer that the threat of posed by climate change is perhaps an area where we could, that's one area where we could agree to work together.
Absolutely. Ellen, same question to you. Would you join in there with the general, or have you got another risk that you
well, first of all, thank you. I'm delighted to be part of this, and I've always enjoyed conversations with Matt Burrows and the Atlantic Council. So I'm really quite pleased that General Clapper has put this existential threat of climate so high on the list. And I guess when I think about the risks, I put them in three baskets, but they're all interconnected. And I think it's looking at where they interconnect that is so hard for us to do as a bureaucracy and as a sort of analytic process. So there's the geopolitics, and maybe that's not the one that is not known to us. We all have been so deeply focused on the rise of China, managing Russia, sort of that phenomenon of shifting geopolitics away from a Western liberal order, if you will. But these transnational problems between COVID, climate change, food insecurity, they're all interrelated cluster, and they do require a kind of multilateral institutional response that I don't think we have. I appreciate the hopefulness that multilateralism will get another chance now that we'll be entering a post-Trump period. But it's not just President Trump who was so aggressively skeptical and dismissive of multilateralism. There's other trends in the international community that also have become fatigued with whether these multilateral institutions can really deliver the goods. So can we reinvent multilateralism or reinvigorate the existing institutions to deal with these enormous problems? But I want to put much more prominently on the list of kind of uncertain risks is how America's domestic problems are going to change how we behave, how others perceive us, and the sort of, will we really be able to reassert leadership in the international community if the rest of the world sees us as the wounded giant or as a country that is in a very painful and difficult transition? even how do our experienced policymakers, and the Biden team looks like these are people who are very knowledgeable and savvy and street smart and understand how bureaucracy works. But what assumptions are they making about America's ability to really stay focused on a global role when the domestic problems are as deep as they are? So I'm looking for new ways to think about how our domestic vulnerabilities will limit and shape our foreign policy options, and will we not really be able to take advantage of all the opportunities that may be out there because we are both preoccupied with domestic uncertainties and because others no longer see us as the penultimate problem solver. So I'm looking for how to connect these different kinds of risk clusters, if you will.
That is such a smart segue into the topics that I wanted to address next. So I think maybe we get to multilateralism, dive into that as a second stage. But this point about fixing domestic American politics or society first. I mean, I would just back you up there, Ellen, where obviously you can tell from my accent, I grew up in Australia. But if I think about all the other friendly foreigners that I've had discussions with in the course of this year, it strikes me very much that they've started to not just wonder about the hyperpolarization in debate here, but whether the wheels are falling off the American system in general. And so they really think of that beyond Trump terms, and they think COVID as the crystallizing event or series of events there. So I guess then the follow-up question I have for you is, we have probably the risk now of vaccine skepticism holding back some of that American recovery right at the moment when American innovation has delivered what could be the solution. What do you see as the risks around something like vaccine skepticism? And is addressing that the solution to getting the domestic house in order? Or is it something much more complex, like infrastructure investment and the Build Back Better agenda?
So it is my impression that the public health professionals are very nervous that we will lag behind other parts of the world in being able to establish herd immunity, that we just have a larger percent of our population that thinks they don't have to follow the rules or has a disdain for what public institutions tell them, and much higher levels of compliance in other parts of the world. But I guess where I would connect your question to a wider issue is whether other parts of the world are, both by design and by default, able to pick up more of a leadership role. And that could be a net positive for the United States, but it will still be a big psychological and political adjustment for us to be told by the Europeans, oh, don't worry, we've got it, we're on top of this problem, or look to us for advice, we'll be the ones to set the new norms on a particular arena of public policy. So I think we're in for a very big adjustment, and it's not all bad. I mean, greater regional ownership or greater distribution of leadership among the middle powers of the world is perhaps a positive development, but it's going to feel a little bit strange for the United States. We do make this assumption. We still believe in our exceptionalism. We still believe that somehow with scientific know-how and with political and organizational talent, the United States has sort of a natural endowment for world leadership. And yet all of those assumptions, I think, are a little bit shaky right now.
General, if I could turn to you, what do you think the long-term effects of COVID-19 may be on US global leadership and the global order more generally?
Well, the first thing, of course, is we need to get our arms around the unmitigated disaster that the pandemic has represented just to the United States. And I think, I think this kind of reinforces Ellen's point that our credibility here is in question because of our inability. Here we are, the richest country in the world, most prosperous, and we couldn't find our way out of this. And that is clearly going to be a preoccupation of the new administration, is getting its arms around this pandemic and the attendant economic impact not to mention the racial strife that is preoccupying the country as well. So I think to Ellen's point, I think there are a lot of countries still that do look to the United States, our traditional allies, friends and allies, the Five Eyes, Germany, France, etc., that would still look to the United States to assume a position of leadership. But I think the first task is try to get our house in order at home, and so that's going to have an impact on the extent to which people, other countries, accept that leadership. While I think there are many who still seek it, but I think the main focus of the new administration is going to be domestic, and the administration's got a lot of anchors kind of holding it down, not the least of which is the divisiveness and polarization in this country, and the skepticism by a large number of people in this country about legitimacy of the election, and recognizing the president-elect as the president. And so I think the preoccupation is going to be first and foremost domestic.
Mm-hmm. With that in mind, I guess I would perceive one of the areas where there is rising bipartisan interest or support is in how to deal with the Chinese bilateral relationship. But then if we connect that into the multilateral question, do either or both of you see the need for more structured shows of force with democratic allies? You know, I would take the live example of my home country, Australia, and the escalating economic punishment that China is applying there. And it's hard to pick a forum for action because China's in the G20, so you can't really go against them there. Australia is not in the G7 or NATO. WTO is immobilized. Is there anything the Biden administration can or should be doing to find ways to concretely support Australia or the next Australia? Because there will be another Australia that China picks on.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I think the only way you can get China's attention, and if there's any prospect of inducing a change in their behavior, is multilaterally. I mean, it's kind of ironic that the Trump administration chose to pitch out of the TPP, which, had we stayed in it, I think might have the prospect of inducing change in Chinese behavior would have been a lot better than our going about it unilaterally. So, and the same is true of South China Sea. I think the only hope of inducing a change in behavior by the Chinese there is if ASEAN were to speak with a unified voice. Well, it's probably not going to, because of the economic grip that China has on individual members. Philippines and Cambodia come to mind. So I think that's the only hope. When we pitched out of the TPP, the Japanese kind of fashioned a new form of it, which would allow re-entry by the U.S., although I think that'll probably be with conditions. But I think to just cut to the chase here, I think the only hope of inducing a change in Chinese economic behavior is through multilateral pressure.
Ellen, what would you say to that?
Okay, so first, I think some of the things that China does will require a security response, a presence, a kind of coercive, subtle, not go to war, but demonstrate red lines and boundaries. And I think the United States will certainly be the primary actor, but we will look for, participation and support and integration of effort by Japan, Australia, and even NATO allies that are now thinking hard about their responsibilities in the rise of China world. But I want to, go at your question a little differently. I think that Biden's interest in reasserting a kind of club of democracies is is even broader than just a response to China. It's a response to authoritarianism more generally. So it's a response to Turkey and Hungary and Poland and countries that are drifting away from a sort of mature democratic path, or mature may not be the right word, but a sort of solid commitment to democratic culture and practice. My understanding is that the Biden administration can use several different vehicles to do this. They could do the club of democracies that came out of the late Clinton administration. There's a D10 idea that I think was generated by Condi Rice and the Bush administration about a small cohort of countries that can declare their shared values and shared principles. So I think it's bigger than China. I don't think China cares about the democracy question. That's not important to them. But I think for the more general proposition that we should be worried about the rise of authoritarianism and that democracies in general are on the defensive, there's an eroding, confidence that democratic systems work. So I think that this revalidating democracies has a global purpose to it, not just a part of the China strategy.
And now if I could switch a little to sort of which allies to be working with, I guess. I perceive that the team around Biden thinks something like Brexit is an unnecessary nuisance, given all of these extra complications and problems that it has to be dealing with. Nevertheless, it's a reality. So I wonder whether it means that the Biden administration simply has to do the extra work of treating the UK and the EU as equal partners, especially given the UK's military, or whether it means somebody like the UK inevitably slides back to a secondary rank and Biden just has to manage the best he can. Open floor.
Well, Ryan, if you're asking me, I have had some interaction with the transition team. I'm not sure they've addressed that yet at this point, and I'm not sure, frankly, what to do about that, about Brexit. I don't have insight into just how new administration might treat that. Maybe perhaps Ellen knows, but I don't, and it frankly doesn't appear to me to be real high on their priority list right now.
Yeah, I personally perceive that the UK is diminished as a global actor and as the premier American partner. So I think there'll be friendly relations. I think there'll be plenty of room for cooperation and coordination of effort. But I do think if we look out at the global stage, the UK has a little bit untethered itself from the normal networks, and that is going to be painful to watch. I think France, of the European allies, France is the one that still aspires to be a global actor and has more ambition. But I think that, Biden's default position will be, I like NATO, I trust NATO, we know how to work together, we know how to talk to each other, and the Brits are still in NATO. So, there will certainly be opportunities for security cooperation, deep and important and worldwide security cooperation with the UK. So I think that, the EU was never our primary partner anyway. It was, these other institutional arrangements. So, but I do think that if we take Britain and France as the other players on this permanent Security Council members, France still sees itself having an upward trajectory, and I'm not sure that's true for the UK.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Ellen, if I could move to one of your areas of specialty now, the Middle East. That's clearly one area where the Trump administration feels like it's made progress. I think there is a general recognition that there is some progress there. As we move to more and more green energy, as more countries normalize their relations with Israel, is it reasonable to assume that the Middle East will occupy fewer American financial and military resources, less of our political capital? Or am I being naive and premature to kind of even go there?
Well, the Middle East has proven to be sticky over the years, that presidents think they can put it on the back burner and then it always pulls them back in. I think the US has a deeply cares and is committed to a set of countries in the Middle East. They would certainly want to keep the momentum up of the integration of Israel into the regional economy and regional security relationships. But for sure, three presidents from Obama through Trump to President Biden believe that the United States got overcommitted in the Middle East, and that we have to find ways to draw down at least the military component of our presence. I think it remains to be seen whether we can really re-energize the diplomatic part and even the aid relationships. I think there's a great expectation that we will shift to a more civilian-led strategy for the Middle East, and I certainly hope that happens. But like in Europe, we're also seeing, greater regional ownership of the regional agenda. So if Israel and the Emiratis and, maybe the Saudis eventually and the Egyptians sort of can all talk to each other in more normal ways and manage some of the lower intensity conflicts of the region together, that's a net positive for the United States. And I would still claim that that is a demonstration of the success of American diplomacy over the decades, that we really did, we tried hard on this big project of integrating Israel more into the region. It is so ironic to me because I think the Israelis offer less of a reassuring message vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And so Israel offers high-tech economics, it offers security, but there are still, parts of the Arab world that will feel great distress at the idea of integrating Israel in the absence of any solution to the Palestine question. So, but in general, I think the Trump team sort of is working on the assumption that they certainly don't want to start another Middle Eastern war. They would like to phase out the ones that are ongoing. But I don't see us turning our backs on the region. And, if you look at CENTCOM, if you look at our military posture in the region, once we draw down from the Iraq and Afghanistan support presence in the region, it will be a smaller footprint, but it won't be insignificant. There will still be a security presence in the region.
Mm-hmm. Does that match up with your assessment, General?
I agree. I think can you hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think Ellen's right. I don't know that we're going to dwell on the Mideast right away. Again, I think, frankly, the Biden administration is going to be consumed with domestic issues. I think it will be interesting to see, how they approach the Abraham Accords. Leave the embassy in Jerusalem. What to do about the Palestinians who sort of been further marginalized? Will the Biden administration seek more Arab state recognition of Israel? But I think, I certainly defer to Ellen's expertise on the Mideast.
Well, how about we join up some of those politics with those domestic problems that you keep mentioning? One of the opportunities in the Atlantic Council paper is listed as a Manhattan Project or similar for battery storage, to enable, among other things, everybody to have affordable electric vehicles. Do you think we should roll the dice on something like that, given what we've been through for decades in the Middle East, given the competitive challenge from China, the cheap credit that governments and their associated entities now have access to?
Well, I don't know. I'm a little out of my area here on domestic issues. I wonder if we're going to do a Manhattan Project, which is turn of phrase that people use a lot. Whether that's the right thing to focus on is certainly worthy, no question about it. But I'm not sure that's if we're going to exert maximum effort, focus, concentrated, spend a lot of money, if that's the right initiative or not, I don't know. I'd be interested in Ellen's view.
Yeah, I also don't know enough about the battery project, but I would say let's think about energy more broadly. I take the point that many people assume that with less reliance, less U.S. dependence on Middle East oil, that takes away at least one of the pillars of the many presidents declaring their, doctrine for the Middle East. So it takes away one of those pillars. I don't think about it that way. I think that we should think of energy self-reliance or energy sufficiency or fair and equitable distribution of energy as a global policy challenge, and that the Middle Easterners can actually contribute a lot on some of the alternative renewable energy. So they can do solar, maybe that's for their own domestic use, but I would still like to see some collaboration on energy solutions. We still have some serious policy challenges worldwide on nuclear energy. Should it be considered a green energy source, or is it a problematic source? So, I'm all for technological innovation, but I don't think they are sufficient to transform whether we think the Middle East is important or not.
Fair points. Now, I want to remind everyone who's tuning in that you can send your questions in. So either via the chat function or with the hashtag Renewing Leadership on Twitter. We'll make sure that we get through to as many as we can. I've got one already. So it's a question to both of you. And it's circling back to transatlantic relations. And the question is, are EU efforts focused on strategic autonomy? So that's the specific phrase, strategic autonomy. It's in a lot of EU papers now. Are they complementary to a renewal of the transatlantic relationship in everything from security to digital policy? Or is this concept of strategic autonomy something that can undermine closer relations?
So I think we've been through several iterations of the Europeans asserting that they want more, whether it's the force de frappe or, they want some indigenous capability that is less dependent on the US. And we get into this kind of funny cycle where first the US says, okay, and then we change our minds and say that's a terrible idea and it will undermine NATO or it will create new inefficiencies. I think we're kind of past that point. I think maybe we're at a different period now where some local or regional level capacity is probably a perfectly desirable and legitimate thing. There will be some interesting questions. Will investments in like homeland security kinds of resources be counted for people's NATO commitments? Will it be counted as the 2% commitment or not? So I'm sure the policymakers can make this extremely complicated if they want to, but I think at the sort of conceptual level, developing more European capacity is less toxic a topic than it was during the height of the Cold War.
Absolutely. General, do you have any thoughts on that question?
I think, like it or not, globalism is here to stay, and I think we are intertwined whether we want to be or not. And so, sure, if people can acquire, be more self-sufficient, that's always a good thing. But I think overall, the notion of isolation or trying to be a self-standing island or something, I don't think that's realistic.
Absolutely. We do have another question in now, and it's getting to the question of the relative risk, how you would rate the relative risk of a global power vacuum. And I think the point the question is making is that if the US continues its relative decline, but the rise of the rest happens slower than that decline is occurring, what's the risk that arises from that fragmentation? And I suppose the elephant in the room there is China.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think this is, I'll take a second for it. I think this is the great world order that was established post-World War II, in which, the U.S. was clearly in a position of leadership for 70 years, I think, or so. That system is changing anyway. And I think starting with the demise of the Soviet Union and leading to a more multipolar world. So if you want to decline that, if you want to characterize that as the decline of the U.S., I guess you could, but it's also, I think, just the natural evolution of things that we will be in a more, as opposed to the bipolar characterization of the Cold War, the two major protagonists, the Soviet Union and the United States. Well, now we're in a multi polar context, and we just need to adjust to that. That's not necessarily all bad, but it's certainly different, and it's, you know, the institutions that the U.S. Formed, led, and which dominated the international system, particularly the financial system. Well, that was under stress in any event, you know, before all our recent upheavals.
Ellen?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. One is, so we do see this drift towards, you know, every nation out for themselves, and that's a trend that's happening. In COVID, it actually worked for some countries, that Taiwan or South Korea were able to just define their own strategies for managing COVID. Those were competent nation states that could do it. There are other crises, and perhaps the Syrian civil war would be an example, where if there is a lack of kind of international direction or leadership, really bad stuff happens. So I take the point that vacuums do happen on discrete problem sets. I'm worried less about a vacuum at the top than competing world orders. So, you know, what we've been calling the international liberal order was really always premised on Western values. It was a Western order, and Asia was a passive member of that order. Now what we have is a rising, in theory, you know, possible, and maybe this is a lot of speculation on my part, but I do worry about China asserting itself to the point of saying, we get to rewrite the rules. So what if you have two orders that are coexisting at the same time? That, to me, does mean that some things will fall through the cracks or won't get the truly coordinated attention that they need.
Maybe if we turn for a second to the risks of either rogue states or states with rogue actions, let's say. We saw Russia, President Vladimir Putin has finally recognized President-elect Joe Biden's win. And he said, quote, that Russia and the US bear special responsibility for global security and stability. And therefore, despite the differences, that the two countries can work together. Do you believe him?
Well, I find it rather poignant that he is asserting that Russia is still a peer of the United States, because by virtually every metric of national power, it's just not true. But Russia has demonstrated a capacity to be an activist on the diplomatic front. And there's another example where you might say, why was the US absent? You know, where the Russians have asserted some leadership on whether it's starting an alternative process to the UN's on the Syrian war or on other, you know, crises around the world. That's something that's kind of interesting to watch. I think the Biden administration will be very wary of Russia these days. Everything from cyber threats to, you know, competition over Central Asia, the Middle East, et cetera, worries about Russian behavior towards the Baltics, et cetera. So I think they will be wary, but they will not be assuming that this is entirely an adversarial relationship. So, you know, they will, I think, try to respond to some of what, if Putin can identify some areas for cooperation, that would probably appeal. But let's remember that a lot of the appointees are from the Obama administration, and the reset with Russia, you know, leaves a bad, you know, a bad taste in their mouths. That was, you know, something that they felt, I think, very bitter about.
Well, if I could add to that, I think to the extent that Russia has any claim to fame as a major power, it's, of course, their nuclear capability, which is still quite substantial. And I do think the Russians are interested in arms control, because that serves their interests. And I think they would like to see an extension of START and perhaps some other arms control agreements, because that serves their interests. But I think Biden administration could be very wary of the Russians.
Absolutely. We have another question in which is trying to look at I don't know if you would call it the margins. It certainly won't feel marginal if you're someone who is facing hunger. But as this great power competition heats up and consumes our political attention, the question is around human insecurity, which is worsening. And it's one of just many non-traditional threats that are moving front and center. So the question here is, how can the US make sure it continues to focus on some of these human issues in this complex environment?
Well, I'm really glad you've raised the question of, food insecurity and, the poverty, all the success, that very favorable line on eliminating the most extreme poverty, and we're slipping backwards, because of the economic consequences of COVID and the shutdown. I thought in Matt and Anka's paper that the economics, the sort of fear of the further collapse of the middle class in the United States, but perhaps elsewhere, people slipping from the middle class into poverty, and food insecurity being a very important component of that, are things that will for sure garner the attention and I think even passion of the Biden administration. Their empathy and their focus on restoring some hope and some prospects for success for ordinary Americans, I think will become a very prominent part of their policy. I am assuming that smart minds can look at, in the past when we've worried about food insecurity, we've said there's plenty of supply, but there's problems of distribution, or there's problems of financing the fair distribution of access to food. And so I hope that whether it's the Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services and the federal agencies will be mobilized to really work on a national plan for distribution of food where needed. But look, I do appreciate the attention to human security, because it's really what makes our countries and our societies stable or unstable. And again, back to the Atlantic Council paper, I would highlight even more than the enduring and expanding, maldistribution of income in the US. The problem of the widening gap between the rich and the poor is something that I think the Biden administration will have no choice but to be seized with.
I might point out there's a relationship here as well with climate change. And the availability of, little known factoid here is the deterioration in the amount of arable soil that is available on the planet. And if you consider the projected population increase of the Earth, I think it raises the question, just what is the Earth's capacity to support humanity? Now, this is, a longer term sort of issue, but again, I just mention this as pervasive impacts of climate change.
Picking up on the financing point of that human insecurity question, I mean, almost just putting aside being a journalist for a second and addressing it at that very personal level, it seems shocking to me the small amounts of money that the World Food Program lacks, or the inability of all countries to fund the ACT accelerator around COVID treatments and vaccines. They're such small amounts compared to the trillions of fiscal stimulus that we've seen applied elsewhere. Leaving aside whether it's fair to expect the US to step in, is it time almost for someone to just cut a check when Biden gets in, given how small these numbers are and how great the problems are that they could solve?
Well, I think he has to be careful that he's spending money on the domestic front first, but often that can be a supplement to the State Department budget, or to, it gets distributed through multilateral channels, et cetera. So one would hope that some of the cutbacks that the Trump administration was very proud of expecting countries to sort of find their own private sector financing for their development projects, maybe some of that will be restored in the next. But remember, the first Biden budget won't be for another year. So it'll take a while for that there may be some emergency supplemental funding that could occur.
Maybe one final question. We're getting towards the end of our time now. So it's that classic one. We've started with the pessimism of the risks. I'm wondering, of all the things that we haven't talked about, what's the thing that most keeps you up at night at the moment?
Well, I try not to lose sleep anymore now that I'm not responsible for anything. I'll tell you two things. I've already spoken about climate change. I think another, perhaps a more spiritual threat is, if you consider climate change a material one, is what the Rand Corporation has aptly and cleverly called truth decay. And this to me is an insidious thing that has been emerging in this country for at least 20 years. It's not unique to President Trump. And it's a phenomenon that we're seeing elsewhere. And this is, the disrespect of empirical data, objective analysis, facts. And all these discussions that we're having here don't mean a whole lot if we can't agree on a basic set of facts. So that does bother me, and I am concerned about it, not only in this country, but in other places as well.
How about you, Ellen? Well,
Yeah,
send us off on a happy note if you prefer.
No, I 1,000% agree that this erosion of respect for expertise. I mean, here we are, the chattering classes that like to analyze things, but there's a big part of our society that thinks this is all bogus, that we're all operating on some self-validating beliefs, and that there's an alternative world out there where people know better of how nasty and mean-spirited and they believe an alternative set of facts. So I would just I totally believe, and it's a challenge for the intelligence community, it's a challenge for how politicians can reach the minds and the hearts of voters, et cetera. But I want to take it the next step, which is my greatest fear is, while there might have been relief that Trump is a one-term president, considering his disregard for institutions and his populist message, I am worried that in intangible ways, that harm of the period we've been through has long-term effects. And so people get radicalized through this access to so-called information, but the fake truths that are out there are radicalizing people. And we are worried again about violence in the United States. And so my great worry is still that Biden will spend his entire presidency trying to restore people's belief and support for national institutions. And so that's going to be a rough road, I think.
Ellen, General Clapper, that brings us to a close. Thank you so much for the clarity and the extensiveness of your thoughts. Thank you to everyone who joined us for this session. And I encourage everyone to tune back in at 9 a.m. US Eastern tomorrow morning for the second half of all of these sessions. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you.